A billionaire's Ferrari defied every expert, then a maid's son solved the mystery. The Ferrari sat in the corner of the garage like a secret that refused to be told. It was red, not the red of traffic lights or warning signs. It was the kind of red that made people stop walking and just stare, the kind that seemed lit from the inside even under the flat white lights of the garage. A Ferrari 458 Italia, one of the most celebrated sports cars ever built, worth more than most people earn in a decade, and it was broken in a way that nobody could explain. Harry Sutton had bought the car 3 years earlier at an auction in Geneva. He had not needed it. He did not need most of the things he owned. He was 61 years old, the founder and majority shareholder of a logistics company that moved freight across 14 countries, and he lived in a large house in the Surrey Hills south of London where the roads curved gently between hedgerows and it was very easy to drive fast without feeling guilty about it. He had other cars, a Range Rover for the winter, an old Aston Martin he kept more for sentiment than speed, but the Ferrari was the one he thought about. The one he had saved for, quietly and without telling anyone, the way a man sometimes keeps a private ambition he is not entirely sure he deserves. For the first 18 months, it was perfect. It moved like nothing he had ever driven. On a clear Saturday morning on the A3, with the sun low and the road empty, it felt less like driving and more like arguing with physics and winning. He loved it the way grown men sometimes love machines, completely and without embarrassment. Then one morning in March, on the slip road joining the M25, something happened. The car hesitated. It was not a lurch or a stall. There was no warning light, no sound. The engine simply paused, a fraction of a second where the power stepped back and then returned, smooth and immediate as if nothing had happened. Harry noticed it and said nothing. He told himself it was the road's surface or a brief dip in fuel pressure or simply his imagination. A week later it happened again. Then again on the way back from a dinner in Guildford. Each time identical, a single pause, maybe a second long, then nothing. The car behaved perfectly before it and perfectly after it. There was no pattern he could find. It happened on fast roads and slow ones, in the morning and at night, in warm weather and cold, and it always vanished before he could be certain he had really felt it. He took the car to the Ferrari dealership in Mayfair. It was the kind of dealership where the floor was polished stone, and the staff wore suits rather than overalls, and the coffee they offered you while you waited came in small ceramic cups rather than paper ones. A senior technician, a man named Gerald who had worked on Ferraris for 22 years, connected the car to a diagnostic system that cost more than most family homes and ran a full check of every system the car possessed. Gerald came back after 2 hours. He had found nothing. Harry described the hesitation again, carefully, trying to use precise language. Gerald listened with the polite and slightly pained expression of an expert being told something he does not believe. He said the car was reading perfectly across all parameters. He suggested it might be a fuel quality issue and recommended a specific premium grade available at certain stations on the motorway network. Harry thanked him, paid the inspection fee, and drove home. The hesitation came back 4 days later. Over the following 8 months, Harry Sutton did what wealthy men do when a problem refuses to yield. He spent money at it. The car went to a specialist Ferrari workshop in Woking that handled cars for several professional racing teams. They kept it for 2 weeks, stripped parts of the fuel system, ran the engine on a dynamometer for 6 hours and found nothing. They charged him generously for the time and returned the car with a detailed report that contained, at its heart, the admission that the fault could not be reproduced under controlled conditions. He sent it to a workshop in Stuttgart, Germany, run by a former Ferrari factory engineer named Klaus, who had a reputation across Europe as the person you called when no one else could help. Klaus kept the car for 3 weeks. He called Harry on a Tuesday evening to report that he had found a minor irregularity in one of the oxygen sensors and had replaced it. Harry felt a surge of relief so strong it surprised him. The hesitation came back on the M3 the following Saturday. He called Klaus. Klaus was quiet for a long moment and then said in careful English that he was not sure what else to try. Word had begun to travel by then, the way word travels in small circles of enthusiasts and collectors. There was a thread on a Ferrari owners forum with over 300 replies. People had suggestions, theories, anecdotes. Someone claimed the same thing had happened to their 458 and had been caused by a faulty throttle position sensor. Someone else argued it was almost certainly an emission system valve. A man in Milan wrote a long and technical post suggesting a software calibration issue in the engine management unit that Ferrari had never officially acknowledged. None of the suggestions, when Harry passed them along to workshops, produced a result. The car had now been examined by 6 workshops in 3 countries, including the Ferrari Factory Service Center in Maranello, Italy, where a technician had driven it for 4 days and logged every data point the car produced and found, once again, nothing he could definitively identify as the cause. The factory visit had been Harry's idea. It had also been expensive, not just in the cost of transport and inspection, but in the quiet embarrassment of having to explain to the people who built the car that the car was doing something unexplainable. The Maranello technician, a young man with very precise English and a very careful manner, had used the word inconclusive twice in his report, which was the technical way of saying that he did not know. 11 months, 6 workshops, 3 countries, approximately £40,000 spent across inspections, parts replacements, transport, and 2 overnight stays in Stuttgart, and the car still paused once on fast roads between the temperatures of somewhere warm and somewhere hot for a single second, then recovered and never mentioned it again. Harry Sutton was not a man who gave up easily. His company had survived 2 recessions and a global shipping crisis that had driven several of his competitors into administration. He was patient, methodical, and not easily rattled, but he was beginning to feel something he had not expected to feel about a car. He was beginning to feel defeated. He sat in the driver's seat one evening in late November, engine off, garage quiet, and looked at the dashboard. All the lights were normal, all the readings were fine. The car smelled faintly of leather and warm metal, and that indefinable smell that performance cars have, the smell of compressed energy and engineered intention. It was beautiful and it was broken, and nobody in the world apparently knew why. He had told his wife Carol about the problem early on, and she had been sympathetic in the way that people are sympathetic about problems they find somewhat unnecessary. She did not say that. She was not that kind of person. But Harry was perceptive enough to understand that her sympathy had a quiet ceiling, and he had by now passed through it. The car represented to her a category of expense she had accepted but not entirely endorsed, and the ongoing repairs had added a dimension of absurdity to that expense that she bore with admirable restraint. His business manager, a careful and literal man named Philip who handled Harry's personal accounts alongside the company finances, had sent a summary the previous week: £41,280. The number sat at the bottom of a spreadsheet column with no comment from Philip, which was itself a kind of comment. Harry had driven back from his last meeting of the year that afternoon, a long lunch with a freight partner in the city, and had come straight to the garage and sat in the car for reasons he could not entirely explain. He was not going to drive it. He was not going to call another workshop. He was simply sitting with a problem he could not solve, in the thing that contained the problem, as if proximity might eventually produce understanding. It did not. He got out, covered the car with its fitted cloth cover, turned off the garage light, and went inside for dinner. The next morning, his cleaner came. Her name was Diane Webb. She had cleaned the house every Wednesday for 11 years. She was quiet, thorough, and they had the kind of comfortable, professional understanding that develops between people who spend a great deal of time in the same space without actually spending very much time together. Harry knew she had 2 sons. He knew she caught the 8:14 from Epsom. He knew she preferred to work with the radio off and that she always left the kitchen last. She arrived at 8:30. Her younger son was with her. This happened occasionally during school holidays when arrangements fell through. The boy usually sat at the kitchen table with a book or a phone, quiet and self-contained, and was gone by the time Harry noticed him. Harry had seen him perhaps 4 or 5 times over the years. He remembered him as a thin, serious child who did not make noise. He was not a child anymore. He was 17, perhaps 18. He had his mother's careful eyes and a stillness about him that was not shyness. He sat at the kitchen table when Harry came down for his second coffee, with a notebook open in front of him and a pencil behind his ear, and he was reading something on his phone with the focused expression of a person who has found exactly what they were looking for. Harry said good morning. The boy said good morning back. His name was Owen Webb. Harry took his coffee to his study and thought nothing more about it. An hour later, he went to the garage to find a document he had left in the Range Rover, and he found Owen Webb standing at the far end of the garage, 3 feet from the covered Ferrari, completely still, head slightly tilted, listening. He had not touched the cover, he had not moved anything. He was simply standing there in the still air of the garage, listening to a car that was not running. Harry stood in the doorway for a moment. "Can I help you?" he said. Owen turned around. He did not look embarrassed. He looked like someone who had been interrupted in the middle of a calculation. "I'm sorry," he said. "I heard it running this morning when you came back. I just wanted to look at it." Harry should have sent him back to the kitchen. Any reasonable person would have. Instead, he found himself asking a question he had not planned to ask. "What did you hear?" Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made Harry Sutton put down his coffee cup and not pick it up again for a very long time. He said he had heard a small inconsistency in the idle cycle when Harry had pulled into the driveway. He said it was the kind of sound that suggested the engine was managing a conflict somewhere in its operating parameters. He said it reminded him of a thermal variance issue he had read about in secondary air injection systems on certain high-performance V8 engines. He said it in simple, direct, unhurried language. He was not showing off. He was answering a question. Harry looked at him for a long moment. "How old are you?" he said. 17, said Owen. Harry pulled the cover off the Ferrari. For the first 10 minutes, Owen did not say much. He walked around the car slowly, not touching it, just looking. His eyes moved across the bodywork the way a person reads a page they have already read before and are now reading more carefully. He crouched at the rear of the car and looked at the exhaust outlets for a while. He straightened up and looked at the engine cover. He walked to the driver's side, glanced through the window at the dashboard, and then stepped back. Harry watched him and said nothing. He was a man who had spent 40 years in business meetings learning when to speak and when to wait, and he understood instinctively that the moment called for waiting. "Can I hear it run?" Owen said. Harry started the engine. The Ferrari's V8 woke up with that particular sound, low and layered, like several different instruments playing the same note. Owen stood behind the car for a while, then moved to the side, then crouched near the rear quarter panel. Harry watched him in the mirror. After 4 minutes, Owen stood up. "Can you rev it gently, just to about 3,000, hold it there for a bit?" Harry did. Owen moved position again. He put his face close to a gap in the rear bodywork, not touching anything, just close. He held that position for nearly a minute. "Okay," he said, "you can let it idle." He came around to the driver's window. Harry lowered it. "When does it hesitate?" Owen asked. Harry explained, the motorway, the slip road. Fast driving for several minutes, then the pause, then nothing. Owen nodded slowly. He was clearly thinking. His eyes were focused somewhere slightly above Harry's shoulder, the look of a person doing arithmetic in their head. "How long into a drive, roughly?" he said. Harry thought about it, maybe 5 or 6 minutes, sometimes a bit longer. "And it's always on faster roads, higher speeds?" "Yes, always." "Does it happen if you just sit in the driveway and run the engine for 5 minutes at idle?" Harry had never thought to try this. "I don't know," he said. "Because if it doesn't," Owen said, "then it's probably temperature dependent rather than speed dependent. You reach a certain engine temperature faster at high speed because the system is working harder. The hesitation might be occurring at a specific temperature window rather than at a specific speed." Harry stared at him. "The workshops all tested it cold or fully warmed up," he said slowly. "Yes," said Owen, "that would miss it. If the fault only exists inside a narrow temperature range, maybe 10 or 15 degrees wide, you would need to test it right in the middle of a warm-up cycle. Not at the start, not at the end, in the middle." Harry got out of the car. He stood next to it in the quiet garage and looked at the 17-year-old boy and felt something he had not expected to feel. Not just surprise, something closer to recognition. The feeling of being in the presence of someone who thinks differently from most people and cannot entirely help it. "What do you think is causing it?" Harry said. And Owen told him. He had been building small engines since he was 11 years old, not toy engines. Real ones pulled from scrapped motorcycles and lawnmowers and one old Ford Transit that a neighbor had abandoned behind his flat in Epsom and then forgotten about. His mother had not known what to make of this hobby. It was not dangerous, exactly, and it kept him quiet, and the neighbor had given permission, but it worried her in the vague way that obsessive focus in a child always worries parents who cannot share the obsession. He had a library card and used it constantly, not for fiction, for technical manuals, engineering textbooks, automotive service guides. The Epsom Library had a limited collection of these, and the librarian, a woman named Helen who had watched Owen come in every Saturday for 6 years, had eventually arranged access through a network of university libraries that allowed him to request specialist texts through an interlibrary loan system designed for postgraduate researchers. Owen had used this to obtain, over the course of 4 years, technical documentation from Ferrari, Porsche, BMW, and 3 specialist publishers of motorsport engineering content. He had also taught himself to listen. This was harder to explain, and he rarely tried. It was not a mystical thing. It was simply the result of years of paying attention to the sounds engines made when something was wrong. A petrol engine is a mechanical system with hundreds of moving parts, and each part produces sound, and the relationship between sounds changes when the relationship between parts changes. Most people hear an engine as a single, unified noise. Owen heard it as a conversation between components, and he had learned, slowly and through many mistakes, to understand what the components were saying to each other. He had first noticed the particular sound he associated with thermal variance in secondary air injection systems when he was 14, working on a scrapped BMW motorcycle engine he had bought for £30. The secondary air injection system is an emissions control mechanism that routes air into the exhaust system to help burn off unburned fuel. In the BMW, the valve housing for this system had developed a microscopic stress crack, and as the engine warmed, the housing expanded fractionally and the crack opened fractionally, and for approximately 90 seconds at a specific temperature, the valve leaked just enough to create a pressure imbalance that the engine management system briefly misread as a throttle command. The result was a subtle hesitation. The result was exactly what Harry's Ferrari was doing. Owen had not diagnosed Harry's car from this single memory. He had diagnosed it from the combination of that memory, 4 years of subsequent reading, and 20 minutes of listening to a running engine in a Surrey garage. The sound profile was not identical to the BMW, but the character of it was. There was a frequency in the Ferrari's idle, audible only at warm temperature and only from the rear of the car, that suggested a pressure irregularity in the emissions management system, rather than in the fuel delivery system or the engine management software. The workshops had been looking in the wrong places because the diagnostic systems they used were designed to find faults that produced data anomalies. This fault produced no data anomaly. It produced a sound. Harry listened to all of this standing in his garage with his arms folded and his coffee going cold on the workbench. Owen was not performing. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was explaining a problem he had found interesting and a solution he believed was correct, and the explanation came out in the same clear, unhurried voice he had used to say good morning in the kitchen. He answered Harry's questions directly and without embellishment. When Harry asked something he was not certain about, he said he was not certain. This happened twice, and both times he explained what further information would be needed to be sure. Harry asked him how he had learned about thermal variance in secondary air injection systems. Owen named 3 sources: a paper published in a specialist automotive engineering journal in 2018, available through the University Library Loan Network; a maintenance manual for a 2011 Ferrari California, which shared several engineering elements with the 458, and a video series on YouTube produced by a retired engine designer named Marco Bellini, who had worked in motorsport for 30 years and now made detailed technical content from a workshop in the north of Italy. Harry had heard of none of these things. He asked Owen what he thought the fix would involve. Owen explained carefully. The secondary air injection valve housing in the 458 was a specific component, part number available in the Ferrari technical documentation. If his diagnosis was correct, the housing had developed a dimensional tolerance issue, possibly from a manufacturing variance in that production batch, possibly from thermal stress over time. The fix would require accessing the component, checking it against factory tolerance specifications at operating temperature, and replacing it with a correctly toleranced part. The part itself was not expensive. The labor in a professional workshop would be 3 to 4 hours. The total cost, Owen estimated, would be somewhere between £800 and £1,200. Harry looked at him for a very long time without saying anything. Then he said, "I have spent £41,000 on this car." Owen did not say anything to this. He did not look sorry or surprised. He simply waited, the way he always waited, for the next question. "And you think the part costs what?" Harry said. "Around £200, Owen said. "Maybe a little more, depending on the supplier." Harry nodded slowly. He picked up his cold coffee and drank some of it anyway. "How do I know you're right?" he said. It was not a hostile question, it was a genuine one. You test it, Owen said. Warm the engine to exactly the right temperature, which is probably somewhere around 85 to 90 degrees Celsius. Then drive it. If it hesitates, the hesitation will be reproducible under those conditions. That gives you a controlled test environment. Then you access the valve housing, measure it under operating temperature, and compare to spec. If the measurements are out of tolerance, that's your answer. Harry set the coffee cup down. He looked at the Ferrari. He looked at Owen. Would you like to be there when they test it? He said. Owen thought about it for a moment, not in the way someone thinks when they are unsure, in the way someone thinks when they are deciding how to say yes without seeming too eager. Yes, he said, I would. Harry called the workshop in Woking that afternoon. He spoke to the lead technician, a man named Greg, who had been one of the 6 people who had previously worked on the car and found nothing. Harry explained the theory. There was a pause on the line. That's a very specific idea, Greg said carefully. I know, Harry said. I want you to test it exactly as described. Warm the engine to 87 degrees, drive it. Then, if the hesitation appears, access the secondary air injection valve housing and measure it against factory tolerance specifications at operating temperature. Another pause. Where did this come from? Greg said. Harry thought about how to answer that. Someone with very good ears, he said. The appointment was set for the following Thursday. Greg said he would need most of the day. Harry said that was fine. He went back inside and found Owen at the kitchen table with his notebook, writing something quickly, the pencil moving in short, focused bursts. Diane was in the kitchen, and she looked up when Harry came in with an expression that was half apology and half something else, something between pride and worry, the expression of a parent who has learned to live with not entirely understanding their child. I hope he wasn't bothering you, she said. He was helping me, Harry said. Can I ask, does he know how good he is? Diane was quiet for a moment. She looked at her son at the table, still writing, not looking up. He knows what he knows, she said. He doesn't always know what to do with it. Harry nodded. He understood that. He had known a few people like that in his life, people who carried a particular ability that the world had not yet found a proper container for. Would it be all right, he said, if he came with me to the workshop next Thursday? I want him to see the test. Diane looked at him for a moment, then she looked at Owen. Owen, she said. Owen looked up. Mr. Sutton wants to know if you'd like to go to a workshop with him next week. Owen looked at Harry. His expression was very careful, very still. To test the theory, he said. To test the theory, Harry said. Owen looked back down at his notebook. He wrote one more thing, then he put the pencil down. Yes, he said, I'd like that. The workshop in Woking occupied a long, low building on an industrial estate near the edge of town. It did not look like the kind of place where expensive cars came to be saved. The exterior was plain brick, the signage modest, the car park shared with a plumbing supplier next door. But inside, the space was serious. 4 lifts, each capable of handling the weight of a full racing car. Diagnostic equipment along one wall that represented in total more computing power than most small offices. The smell of warm metal and high-grade lubricant. The sound of precision tools used by people who understood what they were doing. Greg met them at the door. He was a compact, quiet man in his mid-40s, with the handshake of someone who worked with their hands and the eyes of someone who worked harder with their mind. He had been in motorsport engineering for 20 years before moving to private client work, and he had a reputation for being the person you called when everyone else had failed. He had failed with Harry's Ferrari, and this was not something he had made peace with. He looked at Owen with undisguised curiosity. Harry made brief introductions. Greg shook Owen's hand. He did not ask the question that was clearly visible in his expression, which was, how old are you and why are you here? Instead, he said, you want to walk me through the theory again. Owen did. He was precise and thorough, and he used the same language he had used with Harry in the garage, simple and direct with technical terms applied correctly rather than impressively. Greg listened without expression, which was, Harry had learned, his listening face. Twice he asked Owen to repeat something. Once he asked a question that took the conversation sideways into a discussion of thermal expansion coefficients in aluminum alloy housings, and Owen answered it in a way that made Greg go quiet for a moment. After 8 minutes, Greg said, all right, let's see. He had set up the test exactly as Owen described. A calibrated temperature monitor connected to the engine management system, set to alert at 87 degrees Celsius. The car would be warmed from cold, temperature monitored precisely, and at the target temperature it would be driven on a controlled route on the Industrial Estates Access Road, a long straight used by lorries at a sustained speed. They watched the warm-up from the monitoring station. Owen stood next to Greg at the laptop that displayed the live engine data. Harry stood slightly back. He had brought coffee in a flask, which nobody wanted. At 84 degrees, Greg got into the car and began the test drive. Owen watched the screen. The data streams showed fuel delivery, throttle position, oxygen sensor readings, exhaust temperature. Everything was normal. Everything was within range. The numbers moved in the calm, regular patterns of a well-functioning engine. At 87 degrees on the third pass of the access road, the graph line for fuel delivery dropped for exactly 1.3 seconds and then returned to its previous level. Greg felt it in the car at the same moment. The data showed it on the screen. He came back into the workshop and parked the car and got out. He looked at Owen, then he looked at Harry, then he looked back at Owen. "It's there," he said, "reproducible." Owen nodded. He had not looked surprised. He looked like a person who had expected the result and was now ready for the next step. "Can you access the housing?" Owen said. Greg went to work. It took 40 minutes to reach the secondary air injection valve housing, a component tucked into a corner of the engine bay that required removing several other parts to access. It was the kind of task that the diagnostic checklists did not include because the system it belonged to was peripheral, a support system for emissions management, not considered a candidate for causing drivability faults. Greg removed the housing. He set it on the workbench. He connected the temperature measuring equipment and allowed the housing to return to the temperature it had been at during the test. He took the dimensional measurements. He compared them to the factory tolerance specifications on his laptop. He straightened up. He looked at the housing, he looked at the specifications, he looked at Owen. "Out of tolerance," he said, "by about 12 microns in the seating dimension. At cold temperature it's within spec. At operating temperature, expansion takes it out by just enough." The number was 12 microns, less than the width of a human hair, an amount invisible to the eye, undetectable by hand, unmeasurable by any of the standard diagnostic systems that had been connected to this car across 6 workshops in 3 countries. 12 microns, 41,000 pounds. The workshop was quiet for a moment. Harry stood very still. He was a man who had built a large company by solving problems, and he had never before encountered a problem that was solved by a sound rather than a measurement. He was aware of something he could not name exactly, a feeling between humility and wonder, the feeling of having spent a very long time looking at a door and then discovering that someone else could see right through it. Greg looked at Owen again. He did so with the careful attention of someone revising a prior assessment. "How did you know to listen for it?" Greg said. "I learned from a BMW," Owen said. Greg seemed to accept this. He understood the logic of it, the way experience with one engine system transfers to another, the way understanding a mechanism in one context allows you to recognize it in a different one. He had done this himself across 20 years. The difference was that it had taken him 20 years and it had taken Owen 4, and Owen had done most of it from library books and a YouTube channel. Greg said, "What do you want to do about it?" He was asking Harry, but he glanced at Owen. Harry said, "Fix it, correctly toleranced replacement part." Greg nodded. He said he would source the part. It would take a few days. The repair itself would take 3 to 4 hours. He gave a cost estimate. It was £940, including parts. Harry said that was fine. Greg went back to the workbench and began making notes. He was the kind of man who recorded things carefully, who liked documentation. He was writing this down because he intended to write it up for his own records as one of the more unusual diagnostic cases he had handled. He would not include the source of the diagnosis in his technical notes. He was not sure how to classify it. Owen stood at the workbench and looked at the housing. It was an ordinary-looking piece of engineering, machined aluminum, precise and utilitarian. He picked it up when Greg was not looking and turned it over in his hands and felt its weight and put it back down. Harry watched him. "Can I ask you something?" Harry said. Owen looked up. "You said you teach yourself from books and videos. Have you thought about formal study, engineering at university?" Owen was quiet for a moment. "I'm applying next year," he said. There's a scholarship. The Royal Academy of Engineering runs a program for students from lower-income backgrounds who want to study mechanical or automotive engineering. I've been preparing the application for a while. Harry said, "What do you need for the application?" Owen considered the question carefully. "Evidence of relevant experience," he said, "and a supporting statement from someone in the industry, ideally someone with professional credentials in engineering or automotive work." He did not look at Harry when he said this. He looked at the housing on the workbench. He was 17 years old and he had been planning this conversation, or a version of this conversation, for considerably longer than Harry would have imagined. Harry was quiet for a moment. He looked at the housing too. "You came prepared," he said. "I try to," Owen said. The replacement part arrived on a Tuesday. Greg had sourced it from a specialist supplier in Germany, a component manufactured to tighter tolerances than the original, which was a known option for the 458 among serious owners who wanted to address the thermal expansion sensitivity of the standard part. The supplier confirmed it was the correct specification and supplied full technical documentation, which Greg read carefully and Owen read more carefully. The repair took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Greg did the work himself, which was not always how it went at the workshop. Simpler jobs went to his 2 junior technicians. This one he handled personally, and he knew why, though he would not have said so out loud. There was something in the diagnosis and the manner of it that had made him want to be thorough in a way that went beyond professionalism. He had been doing this job for 20 years. He did not enjoy being surprised. He had been surprised. He intended to make sure the repair was correct. Owen was there for the second half of the repair. Harry had collected him from home that morning, a Tuesday, which was Diane's working day. She had looked at them both from the front door of their flat in Epsom, with an expression that Harry could not entirely read, something between gratitude and something harder, the expression of a person who is watching something shift and is not yet sure whether the shift is good. Owen sat on a stool near the lift and watched Greg work. He asked 2 questions during the repair. Both were good questions, the kind that showed he was following not just what Greg was doing but why. Greg answered them without stopping work, which was itself a kind of acknowledgement. He did not answer questions from people who were not worth answering. When the housing was fitted and the surrounding components reinstalled and the car lowered from the lift and the engine started, the 3 of them stood in the workshop and listened. The engine ran, smooth, layered, the particular sound of a Ferrari V8 expressing itself without restriction. No oscillation, no frequency in the idle that did not belong, just the sound of a well-made thing working as it was made to work. Greg connected the diagnostic system and ran the warm-up cycle. They watched the temperature climb, 80 degrees, 83, 87. The fuel delivery line on the graph was flat and smooth. It did not dip, it did not hesitate. Greg said, "Take it out." Harry drove. Owen sat in the passenger seat, which he had not expected, and sat in very carefully, as if the seat were also a piece of evidence. The car felt different from the moment it moved, not dramatically different, not transformed, just completely itself without the subtle wrongness that had been present for nearly a year. The power came when asked and stopped when released, and between those 2 moments there was nothing, no pause, no step back, nothing that should not have been there. On the access road at speed, through the temperature window that had previously contained the fault, the car ran without hesitation. Harry drove back into the workshop and parked and got out. He said nothing for a moment. Greg was at the diagnostic screen. He looked at the data from the test drive. He looked at Harry. He gave a small, single nod. Harry sat down on the stool that Owen had been using and looked at the car. 41,940 pounds, and 940 of that had fixed it. He did not feel angry. He had thought he would when this moment came, if it came. He had imagined on various evenings over the past year, feeling a sharp and justified anger at all the workshops and all the technicians and all the diagnostic systems that had failed where a teenager with a library card had succeeded, but the anger was not there. What was there instead was something quieter and less familiar, a kind of rearrangement of his understanding of how problems were solved and what kind of knowledge was valuable and where it was likely to be found. He looked at Owen. Owen was looking at the car with the expression he had worn in the garage in Surrey, the expression of a person who has found what they were looking for and is already thinking about what comes next. "It's right now," Owen said. It was not a question. "It's right," Harry said. Owen nodded. Harry said, "Come and have lunch with me." They went to a pub on the edge of the town, a quiet place with wooden tables and food served without ceremony. Harry had a pie. Owen had a sandwich and ate it with the methodical focus he applied to everything. They did not talk about the car for the first 20 minutes. Harry asked Owen about school. Owen described it with the same direct economy he used for everything, not negatively, just accurately. He was finishing his A-levels. Maths, further maths, physics, and design and technology. His teachers were, for the most part, good people doing their best with large classes and limited time. He had learned most of what mattered to him outside school. This was not a complaint, it was an observation. Harry asked about the scholarship application. Owen had been working on it for 8 months. The Royal Academy of Engineering program was competitive. Around 60 applicants were shortlisted annually. 12 were awarded full scholarships covering tuition, accommodation, and a living bursary for the full duration of a 4-year engineering degree at a participating university. Owen wanted to study at University College London. The mechanical engineering program there had a motorsport specialization in the 3rd year. He had read the module specifications for every year of the course. He had emailed 2 of the program's academic staff with questions about the curriculum. They had responded, which had encouraged him. The application required an academic reference, a personal statement, and a professional supporting letter. The personal statement was written. The academic reference was arranged. The supporting letter required someone with recognized professional standing in engineering or a related technical field. Owen did not ask Harry for the letter. He had not asked him in the workshop either. He explained the requirements factually, answered Harry's questions directly, and drank his orange juice. Harry said, "I'll write the letter." Owen looked at him. "You're not an engineer," he said. "No," Harry said, "but Greg is." Owen was quiet. "I'll ask Greg to write the technical letter," Harry said. "He has professional credentials in motorsport engineering that are directly relevant to the program. I'll write a separate supporting statement as someone who witnessed your work firsthand. 2 letters are better than 1. Owen considered this. "Applications close in February," he said. "Then we have time," Harry said. "I'll speak to Greg this week." Owen nodded. He picked up the second half of his sandwich. "Thank you," he said. He said it simply, without performance, the way he said everything. Harry said, "You solved a problem that 6 professional workshops and a factory technician could not solve. You didn't need my help for the hard parts." "I needed the garage," Owen said. Harry almost smiled. "Yes," he said, "you needed the garage." When they got back to the workshop, Greg was at his desk writing up the repair documentation. Harry spoke to him for 10 minutes. Greg listened. He looked across the workshop at Owen, who was examining the torque specifications on a wall-mounted chart with genuine interest. "I'll write the letter," Greg said. He said it without hesitation, which surprised Harry slightly. Harry said, "You're sure?" Greg looked at him with the expression of a man who has very precise opinions about competence and does not waste words explaining them. "In 20 years," Greg said, "I have had 3 apprentices who could diagnose from sound. One of them now runs a Formula 2 team. One of them designs gearboxes for a manufacturer in Turin." He paused. The third one gave up after 18 months because the pay in the early years was not enough. He looked at Owen again. "I will write the letter," he said. Owen went back to Epsom that evening on the train. He did not have a car, and Harry had offered to drive him, and he had politely declined, which Harry respected. On the train, he opened his notebook and wrote several pages of technical notes about the repair, the component specifications, the temperature data from the diagnostic screen, the dimensional measurements Greg had described. He wrote from memory, quickly and accurately, because he had been paying attention all day. At home, he sat at the kitchen table and told his mother what had happened. Diane listened without speaking. She had a cup of tea in front of her, and she held it with both hands and looked at her son as he described the test, the graph, the housing, the measurement of 12 microns, the replacement part, the clean test drive. She had understood from the beginning that he was unusual. She had understood it before he could articulate words, when he was 2 years old, and the thing that held his attention the longest was the washing machine, watching it turn with the focused patience of a person waiting for a very important result. She had spent 17 years worrying about him, not because he was troubled, but because the world has a specific difficulty with people who understand it at an angle. They are necessary and awkward and sometimes invisible until they are suddenly not. "The letters," she said. "Greg will write one," Owen said, "and Mr. Sutton." She nodded. She looked at her tea. Is that what you needed? She said. Owen thought about it. He was honest about these things with himself and with her. It's what the application needs, he said. It's not what I needed. I needed to hear the engine. She looked at him. He said, I already knew what was wrong with it. I just needed a garage. She smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that contains things that cannot be said. You always need a garage, she said. He said, I know. Outside the kitchen window, the last of the evening light was going. On an industrial estate in Woking, in a clean and well-ordered workshop, a red Ferrari sat under a cover, all its systems balanced, its engine exactly as it was designed to be. Tomorrow, Greg would file the repair documentation in the client records. He would note the cause, the solution, the component specification, and the tolerances achieved. He would not note in the official record how the diagnosis was made. But in his own notebook, the one he kept separately from the professional files, he would write it down. He kept notes on the unusual cases. He had been doing it for years. In 20 years of work, the notebook had 43 entries. The 44th read as follows. Cause identified by ear, by a 17-year-old, son of a cleaner, no formal training, no diagnostic equipment, correct on every count. He underlined the last line, then he closed the notebook and went home. The scholarship letter from the Royal Academy of Engineering arrived on the 14th of February, which Owen would later say was a date he had not chosen on purpose, but that his mother would insist meant something. It was a Tuesday. Diane was at work. Owen was at the kitchen table with his further maths textbook, working through a problem set on differential equations, when the email notification appeared on his phone. He had been waiting for it since November and had trained himself imperfectly not to check the application portal more than once a day. He had checked it twice that morning already and told himself that was the last time. He read the email once, then he put his phone face down on the table and continued the differential equation. He finished it, checked his working, found a small error in the third line, corrected it, checked again, and confirmed the answer. Then he picked up his phone and read the email again. He had been shortlisted. Of 63 applicants, 12 had been awarded scholarships. His name was on the list. The scholarship covered tuition in full, accommodation at UCL for the first year, and a bursary of £10,000 annually for living expenses. It was renewable annually subject to academic performance. The letter invited him to attend an awards ceremony at the Academy's offices in London in March and asked him to confirm acceptance within 14 days. Owen sat at the kitchen table and looked at the differential equation he had just completed. He thought about the BMW motorcycle engine in the scrap transit van. He thought about Helen at the library arranging interlibrary loans. He thought about Marco Bellini's YouTube videos, watched at 11 o'clock at night on a phone propped against a stack of library books. He thought about the Ferrari in the garage, the sound of it idling, the specific frequency buried in the warm hum of a V8 that had told him something was wrong and where and roughly why. He thought about 12 microns. He called his mother. She answered on the second ring. He could hear, faintly, the sound of a radio in the background, which meant she was at one of her other houses, the one in Leatherhead with the kitchen that always had the radio on. I got it, he said. There was a silence, not a long one. Owen, she said. I got the scholarship, he said. He heard her put something down. He heard the radio in the background. He heard her breathe. Say it again, she said. I got the scholarship, he said. Full scholarship. UCL starts September. She made a sound he had not heard very often. It was not crying exactly. It was the sound of something held tightly for a long time being, very carefully, set down. He waited. She said, you worked so hard. He said, you worked harder. She laughed at that. It was a short laugh that turned into something else briefly and then became a laugh again. He told her about the ceremony in March. He told her the details of the bursary. He told her that acceptance had to be confirmed within 14 days, which he intended to do within 14 minutes. She listened to all of it. She asked about accommodation. He said the scholarship covered the first year in halls and he would apply for university-managed accommodation in subsequent years, the costs of which the bursary would cover with room for other expenses. She said, I'll come to the ceremony. I know, he said. I already planned to ask you. Harry Sutton heard about the scholarship 2 days later. Owen sent him an email. It was concise and formally worded, thanking him for the supporting statement and informing him of the result. It included a one-line sentence at the end that said the diagnostic experience at the walking workshop had been included in his personal statement as an example of applied learning, and that the selection panel had specifically noted it during the shortlisting process. Harry read the email at his desk and then walked to the window that looked out over the garden. It was a gray February morning, the kind of English morning that does not commit to anything. He stood at the window for a while. He thought about the 11 months, the 6 workshops, the £41,000, the Marinello technician who had used the word inconclusive twice. He thought about Owen standing in the garage, 3 feet from a covered car, completely still, listening. He replied to the email. His reply was longer than Owen's, which was appropriate. He congratulated him. He said that the supporting statement had been easy to write because the observation had been easy to make. He said that he hoped Owen would continue to work with engines throughout his degree, not just in the academic sense, but in the physical, practical sense, the way he had been doing since he was 11. He said that the ability Owen had was the kind that formal education could refine and credential, but could not create. He did not say that he intended to do more. He had decided not to mention it until it was certain. What he had decided in the days after the walking workshop and before the scholarship was announced was this. His company had an engineering apprenticeship program. It was small, 2 or 3 placements a year, mostly focused on logistics technology and fleet maintenance. He had spoken with his operations director about whether the program could be extended to include an automotive or mechanical engineering placement, structured around university terms, allowing a scholarship student to do practical work during the longer university holidays and receive additional paid experience that would complement the academic program. His operations director, a thorough woman named Caroline who had managed the company's infrastructure for 9 years, had said it was possible and had outlined what it would require, and Harry had said do it, and she had begun the process. He did not know yet whether Owen would want it. He had learned over the past months that Owen was not the kind of person who accepted things he had not decided he wanted. He would offer it and wait for the answer, and the answer would come in the same direct, considered way that all of Owen's answers came. He wrote a second email brief to Greg. Greg replied within an hour. The reply said, "Good." It said nothing else, which was entirely consistent with everything Harry had learned about Greg in 20 years of being his client. Harry went back to his desk. He had a call in 10 minutes with a freight partner in Rotterdam and 3 documents requiring his attention and a lunch he had agreed to that he was now regretting. He organized his desk, opened the Rotterdam notes, and prepared for the call. His phone lit up once more before the call connected. A message from Carol, who had heard about the scholarship from him that morning over breakfast, and who had, in her quiet and not entirely legible way, been following the story since the garage and the garage and the garage. The message said, "That boy is going somewhere." Harry typed back, "I know." Then he set the phone down and took the call. In Epsom, Owen was at the kitchen table again. He had confirmed the scholarship acceptance. He had read, for the second time, the full UCL mechanical engineering program structure, all 4 years, and had annotated the third-year motorsport module with questions he planned to begin researching before September. He had a list numbered of books he wanted to read before the course began. The list had 11 titles on it. He had also that afternoon bought a second-hand engine. It was a small one from a scrapped ride-on lawnmower purchased for £22 from a man 3 streets away who had advertised it on a local selling page. It was not a complicated engine. It was not a Ferrari, but it made a sound when it ran that he had not yet placed, a small inconsistency in the exhaust cycle, and he wanted to understand what it was. He set it on the workbench he had built in the corner of the kitchen, using 2 sturdy tables pushed together, a setup his mother tolerated with the weariness of someone who had made peace with something years ago. He started the engine. He listened. Outside, the February sky was flat and gray and the street was quiet. In a garage in Surrey, a red car sat at rest, finally and completely itself. In a workshop in Woking, a notebook sat on a desk with a handwritten entry on its last used page. In a building in London, a letter bearing a name and a scholarship number was filed in a folder that would be retrieved in March for a ceremony. And in a kitchen in Epsom, a young man bent his head over a small engine and heard, in the ordinary sound of ordinary combustion, something that no instrument had been calibrated to find. He reached for his pencil. He began to write. And